Everyone thought this story would be about music, a song, a stage, a moment of applause. They were wrong. This wasn't about chords or lyrics anymore. This was about control, ego, and what happens when someone forgets who they're standing in front of. Stephen believed the spotlight was his. He believed playing the song louder, sharper, more aggressive would rewrite history. In his mind, legends fade, and new names replace them. He thought music was a weapon, and that night, he planned to use it. But Ozzy Osbourne doesn't fight with noise. He fights with timing. The room didn't know it yet, but the balance had already shifted. Ozzy watched quietly, calculating. No anger, no reaction. Just silence. The kind that makes confident people uncomfortable. Stephen kept playing, pushing harder, performing like he had something to prove. That was the mistake. Because when someone tries to challenge a legend, they assume the legend will respond the same way. Louder, faster, emotional, desperate. Ozzy did none of that. This wasn't a competition for him. It was a correction. Every note Stephen played felt like a statement. I'm better. I'm next. I don't need you. And Ozzy heard every single one of them. But instead of interrupting, Ozzy waited. Revenge doesn't rush. Revenge observes. The crowd sensed something strange. The energy wasn't excitement anymore. It was tension. Something unfinished was hanging in the air. Stephen thought the silence meant victory. It didn't. It meant permission. Because when Ozzy finally decided to move, it wouldn't be to prove himself. Legends don't prove. They remind. And on that day, music alone wasn't enough. History was about to be enforced. Stephen didn't arrive quietly. He arrived like someone who wanted to be noticed. Sharp clothes, sharp guitar tone, sharper attitude. He didn't come to honor anything. He came to replace. In his world, attention was currency, and legends were obstacles. Ozzy Osbourne, on the other hand, didn't arrive at all. He was already there. No announcement, no build-up, no need for it. Ozzy didn't chase moments anymore. Moments chased him. He stood back, almost invisible, watching the room behave exactly how he expected it to. Loud confidence on the surface, fragile egos underneath. Stephen took the stage like it was his territory. Every movement screamed control. He wasn't nervous, he was hungry. Hungry to prove that history could be rewritten with enough volume and attitude. He chose that song. Iron Man. Not as a tribute, as a statement. He played it differently, faster, harder, twisted just enough to say, I can do this better now. The crowd reacted instantly. Phones went up, heads nodded. Stephen saw it as confirmation. He smirked. What he didn't see was Ozzy watching, not impressed, not threatened. Just attentive. Ozzy had seen this before. Different faces, same mistake. People mistaking noise for power, performance for ownership. Stephen believed playing the song gave him authority over it. That belief was expensive. Every note Stephen played felt intentional, like he was drawing a line, like he was daring someone to cross it. But the challenge wasn't spoken out loud. It was subtle. Disrespect always is. Ozzy said nothing. That silence did more damage than any argument ever could. Because Stephen expected resistance. He expected outrage. Maybe even praise. What he didn't expect was to be ignored. Ozzy's silence wasn't weakness. It was positioning. Stephen pushed harder. His playing grew aggressive. The song stopped being music and turned into a message. This era is over. Mine starts now. The crowd cheered louder, feeding the illusion. But Ozzy knew the truth. You don't defeat a legend by copying their work. You expose yourself by trying. Stephen didn't understand the difference between attention and authority. He thought dominating the moment meant owning it. He didn't realize the moment was borrowed. Behind the scenes, people noticed Ozzy. Not moving, not reacting, just waiting. The kind of waiting that makes confident people uneasy, even if they don't know why. Stephen finished the performance to applause. He soaked it in like victory. To him, this was the peak, the takeover, the proof. He glanced toward the side of the stage. That's when he saw Ozzy. Not clapping, not smiling, just looking at him. And for the first time that night, Stephen felt something unfamiliar. Not fear. Doubt. Because Ozzy wasn't there to compete, he was there to collect. And Stephen had just stepped onto a board that Ozzy built. Without permission. Stephen felt the shift before he understood it. The applause was still there, the noise still loud, but something underneath had changed. The room no longer belonged to him. It was waiting. Waiting for something else. Waiting for Ozzy. Stephen tried to ignore it. He adjusted his guitar strap, paced the stage, soaked in what he thought was dominance. But confidence built on noise doesn't last long. It cracks when silence enters. Ozzy hadn't moved. That bothered Stephen more than criticism ever could. Because legends reacting means validation. Legends staying silent means judgment. Stephen leaned into it. If the legend wouldn't speak, Stephen would force the issue. He grabbed the mic, smiled like someone who believed the game was already won, and let the words fall casually. Too casually. Guess even legends need to hear how it's done now. The room froze. Not gasps. Not cheers. Just a pause. The kind of pause that makes people look at each other, unsure if they just heard what they thought they heard. Stephen thought he'd crossed a line. He hadn't. He'd erased it. Ozzy finally moved. Not toward the stage. Not toward the mic. Just one step forward. Slow. Deliberate. The kind of movement that doesn't demand attention but takes it anyway. Stephen watched him, suddenly aware of how loud his own breathing sounded. Ozzy didn't respond. No insult. No challenge. No defense. That was the most dangerous response possible. Stephen laughed it off, but it came out wrong. Too forced. Too fast. He filled the silence with noise again. Another riff. Another variation of the same song, pushed harder, faster, more chaotic. He wanted to drown out the presence behind him. It didn't work, because Ozzy wasn't competing for sound. He was competing for space. Every note Stephen played now felt desperate. The confidence was still there, but it was sharp, brittle, like glass pretending to be steel. He was performing at Ozzy now, not for the crowd. Ozzy stayed still. He was letting Stephen finish. That's what Stephen didn't understand. Revenge doesn't interrupt. It waits until the other side is done exposing itself. Stephen ended the set with a dramatic flourish, lifting his guitar like a trophy. The crowd clapped, louder than before, but the energy was confused. This wasn't celebration. It was anticipation. Stephen turned fully toward Ozzy. "Your song," he said, shrugging. "My version." That was it. Not disrespect. Ownership. And that's when Ozzy smiled. Not wide. Not friendly. Just enough. That smile carried history. Decades of stages. Battles Stephen had never seen. Crowds Stephen would never face. It wasn't approval. It was confirmation. Ozzy stepped closer to the stage. No mic, no guitar, just presence. The noise in the room lowered instinctively, like people knew something important was about to happen. Stephen realized too late what he'd done. You can challenge a man, you can mock a legend, but you don't claim what you didn't build. Ozzy finally spoke. Not loud, not angry. Interesting. One word. And somehow, it landed heavier than Stephen's entire performance. Stephen tried to respond, but Ozzy didn't wait. He turned away. That was the real blow. Not humiliation. Dismissal. The crowd felt it. Stephen felt it. The power had shifted completely, and Stephen had no idea how fast things were about to unravel. Because Ozzy hadn't come to argue. He hadn't come to compete. He'd come to end the discussion, and the revenge hadn't even started yet. Ozzy turning away wasn't retreat. It was strategy. Stephen stood there for a second too long, unsure whether to speak, to laugh, or to play again. That hesitation cost him. In that pause, the room made its decision. Attention drifted. Eyes followed Ozzy, not the stage. Stephen had lost the center without realizing it. Ozzy moved calmly through the side of the venue, not toward applause, not toward noise, toward authority. A quiet exchange, a nod, no words needed. People who knew, knew. Stephen tried to reclaim momentum. He strummed his guitar again, louder this time, sharper, almost aggressive. The sound filled the room, but it felt empty now, like shouting into a space that had already moved on. The crowd listened out of habit, not interest. Then the lights shifted. Subtle, controlled, not dramatic. Just enough to signal change. Stephen stopped playing. He hadn't been told to. He just felt it. Ozzy stepped back into view, not alone now. A guitar was placed into his hands, not rushed, not announced. It was offered, like something being returned to its owner. Still no mic, still no words. Stephen swallowed. The confidence he'd been wearing all night finally slipped. He wasn't facing a competitor anymore. He was facing a standard. Ozzy stepped onto the edge of the stage, not taking it, just sharing the space. That alone changed everything. The crowd leaned forward without realizing it. Phones lowered. Noise died. Ozzy looked at Stephen, not challengingly, not angrily, expectantly. Stephen hesitated, then nodded. It was small, almost respectful, almost an apology, but it was too late for that. Ozzy adjusted the guitar strap slowly, deliberately, like a man who had done this 1,000 times and never needed to hurry. Then he played. Not loud, not fast, not aggressive, precise. The first note cut through the room like a blade, clean, controlled, familiar, but untouchable. This wasn't a version. This was the source. Stephen froze. Ozzy didn't look at him while playing. He didn't need to. The sound did the talking. Every note carried weight. Not showmanship, not flash, authority. The crowd reacted instantly, not with cheers, but with silence. The kind of silence reserved for moments people know they'll remember. Ozzy wasn't competing with Stephen's performance. He was erasing it. Stephen tried to join in. He matched a chord, added a riff, tried to exist in the same space, but it didn't land. His sound felt layered on top of something complete, unnecessary. Ozzy didn't stop him. That was the cruelty of it. He let Stephen play beside him long enough to understand the gap. Not in skill, in ownership. Ozzy finally looked at Stephen, just once. Not to challenge him, but to acknowledge him. Like a teacher recognizing effort, not equality. Stephen's hands slowed, then stopped. Ozzy continued alone. That was the turning point. No words had been exchanged, no insults thrown, no argument won. But the message was unmistakable. You don't take a throne by standing on it. You earn it by surviving what built it. Ozzy finished the phrase and let the final note hang. He didn't chase applause. He didn't raise his hands. He simply stepped back. The room exploded, not for volume, for finality. Stephen stood there, guitar lowered, exposed, not embarrassed, something worse, corrected. Ozzy handed the guitar back without ceremony and walked away again. This time, no one mistook it for retreat. The revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It was complete. And Stephen knew, deep down, that whatever came next, no matter how hard he played, this moment would follow him forever. Because this wasn't about music anymore. This was about who decides when a moment ends. The room didn't see it coming. Stephen thought the night was over, that the brief interruption of authority was just a pause, that maybe he'd survived the glare of a legend, that maybe, just maybe, he had proven himself. He was wrong. Ozzy Osbourne doesn't wait for permission to teach a lesson. He doesn't rely on applause to validate presence. He relies on timing, and timing had arrived. Ozzy turned slowly toward the stage. Not aggressively, not with a shout. Just one deliberate step forward, and the energy shifted like a magnetic field bending toward him. People who had been cheering moments ago went silent, sensing something powerful approaching. Stephen gripped his guitar tighter. He tried to muster control. He tried to dominate again, but the sound, the space, the very air seemed to reject him. He wasn't performing in front of a crowd anymore. He was performing for Ozzy, and Ozzy was patient. He waited. The first chord came not as a continuation of Iron Man, but as an interruption, sharp, precise, undeniable. It wasn't music for show. It was music as authority. Every note carried history, experience, and dominance. Stephen tried to respond. His fingers scrambled over strings, his chords attempted to cut through the new sound. But nothing landed. The audience wasn't reacting to him anymore. They were witnessing a lesson, a silent decree. Ozzy played not for applause. He played to correct. Every riff Stephen had assumed as his own was dismantled, countered, and rewritten in real time. Not by chaos, not by anger, by mastery. The climax didn't come in volume. It came in realization. Stephen realized that the arena of performance wasn't a contest of who played the loudest or fastest. It was about who dictated the space, who controlled the moment, and who commanded respect without saying a word. Ozzy finished a complex sequence, holding the final chord like a gavel. The note hung heavy in the air, vibrating through walls, into the bones of every person in the room. It wasn't applause he sought. It was acknowledgement of dominance. Stephen's hands shook, not from fear, not from emotion, from comprehension. He had been overconfident, arrogant, loud, and visible, and now he understood how thoroughly he had miscalculated. He had challenged a force far beyond him, a man who built music not to entertain, but to end challenges. Ozzy didn't gloat. He didn't shout. He didn't smirk. He simply lowered his guitar, took a slow step back, and let silence enforce the message. That was the brilliance of it. The room erupted, not in celebration of Ozzy, not in disappointment of Stephen, but in recognition that something decisive had occurred. A silent authority had been reasserted. Stephen dropped his head. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't crying. There was no shame to feel, just the cold, undeniable truth. He had been corrected. Ozzy walked away without looking back. Every step echoed like a verdict. The crowd followed him with their eyes, not their voices, and as he disappeared into the shadows of the backstage, the lesson lingered. Long after applause, long after lights, long after music, music alone hadn't been enough that night. Words had been unnecessary. Only action, timing, and calculated authority had mattered. And Stephen? He had learned the cost of overstepping, not publicly, not dramatically, but internally, permanently. This wasn't revenge as spectacle. This was revenge as truth. Cold, sharp, unyielding. A lesson etched in sound, presence, and authority. Ozzy Osbourne didn't need to fight. He didn't need to shout. He simply acted. And in doing so, he reminded the world, and Stephen, why legends aren't measured by applause, but by who can silence arrogance without even trying. The night ended. The lesson remained. Music was just the medium. Authority was the message. And revenge had been absolute. Stephen stood on the stage long after the final chord faded. The crowd's reaction had been chaotic at first. Applause, murmurs, raised phones, but the noise quickly died down as the truth settled in. This wasn't about music anymore. It was about power, presence, and knowing your place. He looked around, trying to find validation, trying to find someone, anyone, who still treated him as a force to be reckoned with. But the audience was quiet, uncertain, waiting for something else, waiting for Ozzy. That's when it hit him. Ozzy Osbourne didn't need to prove anything. He didn't need to compete or respond to arrogance. He didn't need to say a word to dominate. One calculated performance, one precise correction, and the hierarchy had been restored. The lesson had been delivered, and Stephen had been its target. Stephen's fingers still tingled from the frantic chords he had played earlier. Every note had been a desperate attempt to reclaim control, to assert dominance, to force recognition. And yet, in the presence of someone who built authority, all his efforts had been meaningless. He replayed every moment in his head. The smirk, the challenge, the silence that had unnerved him. The first chord Ozzy played, cutting through the chaos like a blade. The precision, the authority, the effortless reclamation of space. That single, unassuming act had undone hours of performance, arrogance, and bravado. Stephen realized something fundamental. This wasn't a stage anymore. It was a classroom, and he had been failing the lesson spectacularly. The weight of it settled slowly, like a shadow creeping over the room. Every cheer, every clapping hand, every raised phone had already shifted allegiance. The crowd didn't admire Stephen anymore. They had witnessed truth enforced. Stephen's confidence cracked, not publicly, not dramatically, but internally. The realization was sharper than any criticism could ever be. He had underestimated Ozzy Osbourne. He had assumed presence could be challenged with volume, attitude, and flash. He had been wrong. Ozzy walked away quietly. No celebration, no overt display. Just a man leaving after setting things right. And in that silence, the power of his action echoed. The revenge wasn't loud, it wasn't messy, but it was total. Stephen tried to recover, to muster some energy, some spark, but it was gone. Every attempt felt hollow, every movement redundant. The music that once gave him confidence now reminded him of his overreach. He understood now that revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it acts. And when it does, there is no undoing it. For the first time that night, Stephen didn't think about applause, recognition, or proving himself. He thought about respect, about who earns it, who commands it, and who cannot be challenged without consequence. Ozzy had left a mark, not in words, not in anger, not in spectacle, but in authority, in silent domination, in a lesson that Stephen would carry everywhere, long after the lights dimmed, long after the crowd dispersed, long after the echo of music faded. That night, music alone hadn't decided victory. Presence, timing, and control had. And in that reckoning, Stephen had learned the cost of arrogance, the price of overstepping, and the absolute authority of a legend. Revenge had been served, not violently, not dramatically, but completely. And Stephen had no choice but to acknowledge it. The lesson was clear. Don't step into the territory of a king unless you're ready to be reminded why he rules. The night had ended, but the lesson had not. Stephen left the stage quietly, guitar slung low, pride fractured, confidence rattled. He hadn't been humiliated with insults. He hadn't been shamed by mistakes. He had been reminded. A legend doesn't need to scream to assert dominance, one calculated move, one precise display of authority, and the hierarchy is cemented. Ozzy Osbourne had done exactly that. He didn't linger, no bows, no applause, no words of triumph, just presence, just timing, just absolute control. That was the brilliance of it. The crowd was still buzzing, but this time the excitement carried a different tone. They weren't cheering Stephen anymore. They weren't debating skills or performances. They were witnessing a master at work, a man who didn't just play music, he defined it, commanded it, and reminded everyone who owned it. Stephen knew, deep down, that this was more than a lesson for him. It was a statement to anyone who had ever doubted, challenged, or assumed they could outshine a legend. No matter how loud you play, no matter how flashy your performance, some battles are decided before a note is struck. Ozzy's revenge wasn't violent. It wasn't chaotic. It didn't need to be. Every move had been precise. Every note had been deliberate. Every moment had spoken louder than words ever could. He didn't need to confront. He didn't need to argue. He acted, and the truth was undeniable. Stephen would never forget it. Not the music, not the performance, not the crowd. He would remember the weight of presence, the unspoken authority, the lesson enforced with cold efficiency. It was a reminder that arrogance has a cost, and overstepping comes with consequences. The real victory wasn't just for Ozzy. It was for the principle he represented. That talent, history, and control cannot be challenged by mere confidence. That respect is earned, maintained, and reclaimed when necessary. That a legend's authority isn't measured by applause, but by how easily they silence presumptions. As Ozzy walked away, the room seemed to follow him with their eyes. Phones lowered, conversations paused. Even the loudest critics understood. Tonight had ended, and the verdict had been delivered. Stephen, somewhere behind, finally understood the full scale of what had happened. He hadn't lost because of talent. He hadn't lost because of the crowd. He hadn't even lost because of music. He had lost because he challenged someone who doesn't just play. It commands, it dictates, it dominates. There was no anger. There was no regret. Just acknowledgement. The kind that shapes you, haunts you, and changes how you step into the world from that moment on. Ozzy didn't need to say a word to prove anything. The revenge had been complete, total, and unassailable, and Stephen would carry that lesson with him forever. The final note wasn't played on a guitar. It was written in the silence that followed, in the space Ozzy left behind, and in the understanding that some battles aren't won by effort, by noise, or by arrogance. They're won by legends who know when to act, and when to let the lesson speak for itself. Music wasn't enough that night. Words weren't needed. Presence was the weapon. Control was the message. And revenge had been absolute. Ozzy Osbourne walked away into the shadows, leaving a mark that no one could erase. Not on the stage, not in the crowd, not in memory. Some lessons don't fade, they define the future.